here, or did she say she wasn't able to attend? Anyone know?
She's coming. Last time I talked to her,
She
was
is
planning on
coming?
yeah.
Okay, so today is Friday, December 6th. It's 10:05, and I will call this workshop to order. A workshop of the draft capital project prioritization matrix and discussion, budget discussion. So thank you, Rachel, Finance Director Stenta, for joining us this morning and leading us through this workshop. Again, pointing out that this is a workshop and that this is meant to, we're meant to be having conversations about numbers. So hopefully we're all comfortable with that. Take it away, Rachel.
Should I get you another copy of this? Do you need it?
No, I just borrowed yours for a second.
So thank you for spending the time today on a Friday.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt you one more time. I just wanted to make sure that everybody was comfortable with a hard stop at noon. I think it's very important for us to have parameters around time, especially on a Friday afternoon. So wherever we are at noon, we're done. And we will either pend or just let it go. Maybe we can be done before noon.
Oh, really? That'll be my goal. Thank you for coming together to talk about exciting projects, capital projects, prioritizations, and just kind of a budget overview of where we're at in the budget. We're almost mid-year in our budget cycle. And I think we've sat down and talked to all of you individually about the budget, so this will be our public presentation of where we're at.
I'm sorry, I've got to interrupt you one more time.
Okay.
I am so sorry. That we were going to also go into an executive session. So that is included in that stopping at noon. So we're really stopping with you.
Okay.
More like at 11:30.
Okay. My anticipation, could be wrong, is that the budget is probably going to take quite a bit longer than the prioritization. The budget's kind of more of our priority as well. So if it looks like this is going to take longer and we have too many questions, we could maybe talk some more about it. It is on Tuesday's agenda for consideration.
Right.
So just as an FYI.
Thanks, Rachel. Where'd the donuts go? What happened? Bring back. Okay.
Okay, so you've probably seen this material in this packet as well as the previous city council meeting packet. We were trying to fit it in on the previous city council meeting, but it didn't quite work. We had too many exciting things happening at that meeting. But as you're aware, we talked about coming up with a prioritization project for our capital projects to help us with both long-term planning. And then also the debt management policy that the council adopted is kind of a key component to our long-term planning for capital projects to make sure that we're taking on new debt when we have the capacity for new debt, and also making sure that we have collectively prioritized the projects that we want to take on debt for, or that it makes sense to take on new debt for. I'm not going to go through in large detail because you've already had it presented to you in your packet. But we did form a committee. We had a council member that served on the committee as well. And we went through a template of a matrix that rated and ranked projects based on weighted criteria. And just to run through them real quick, they were project category, strategic alignment, financing, service levels, sustainability, multiple improvements, risk assessment, cost benefit or payback, and community and economic impact. Let's just take a look at the matrix. So each of these categories have a maximum value, and then they also have a weight assigned to it, with the idea being that each project is multifaceted. It might help address an existing deficiency in our infrastructure. It might improve a category of service or infrastructure that is a liability to the city. There could be funding sources available that we could match versus having to borrow money. The payback, if we replace that infrastructure, is it going to lower our maintenance and operation costs over the next 5 to 10 years? Will it increase service levels? Does it have a direct impact on our community or on our economy? Sustainability, we talked about the previous workshop when we went through this. We added that in to acknowledge and help recognize that council has sustainability goals that they'd like to meet. And so if a project would further those goals, they would receive a score for that as well.
Rachel,
Yes,
do you want us to see what you're talking about?
yes, I do.
I was curious.
So-
I'm OCD and there's like I'm gonna just fix something.
Oh, the cord, your cord's hanging in the monitor.
I got it. Oh, okay.
My apologies. Now you can see what I'm talking about. I was just talking on my screen. So those are the categories within the matrix. And then the idea would be that the same group would sit down and collectively take all of the projects that are outlined in, for example, water plan, sewer plan, stormwater plan, road plan, or major projects that the departments have identified, that hopefully have been identified already in a long-term planning process. And then we would go through and assess each project based on this matrix. If you're wondering what that would look like, we included some sample projects that have already been completed that we ran through, just to make sure that calibrated to where we thought it would be, that the projects that we've already completed would have been prioritized to be completed. So the one that we're looking at right now is the 100 West reconstruction, which was completed, and it actually addressed.
Rachel, just one sec. Do you want a printed copy of it? I'm trying to pull it up on my computer right now and I forget where. What day was it
agenda.
for today? I just have a lot of it.
I think there's still some.
Here.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
I can check that.
I have a lot of.
Email, it's not on the website, so you have to.
That is why I was troubled. Now I'm no longer troubled.
100%. Okay.
There we are. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry to interrupt
No,
again.
you're fine.
And again.
It's a
and again.
workshop, it's informal. So,
I'll have it, okay.
we just plugged in some projects to give you an idea. When we had talked about it before with the council, it was suggested that if you could actually see how the criteria was applied for existing projects, it would kind of help make more sense of how that rating and ranking would go. So basically, as a group, we sit down with the project and we go through each of these categories and assess a score. Project category, multiple improvements, strategic alignment. This project obviously filled a lot of those, checked a lot of those boxes. At the end of the process, it came up with a score of 78.75. Now, that really only makes sense when you look at it in relation to other projects. So, Aggie Boulevard, for example, we went through and did the same rating and ranking, and again, these are the categories that project covered: street, sidewalk, water, sewer, storm drainage. Aggie Boulevard came up with 41.5. And the next one that we did was Center Street Gym, which is actually included in this budget year, but we haven't started the process yet. And that one came up with 28.25. So the idea behind this, and let me pull up, I have actually well, I'll wait to pull up the flow chart. The idea behind it is once council is comfortable with staff's recommendation on the matrix, on the criteria that's in it, then we have you adopt that matrix, whether if there's changes today or if it stays the same. Then we take all of our capital projects, everything that we've identified, and we run it through this machine to spit out a score, and then we bring a prioritized list back to the city council to say, these are the top rated projects. These are the ones that we need to address in the next 2 to 3 budget cycles or in the next 5 years. And then that outlines a plan for us to go out and seek funding from federal sources, state sources, depending on the project, potentially private grants and or financing. The financing piece is the most important piece for us because as we're planning out our operational revenue and our capital projects revenue, there's only so much debt that we can take on. So whenever we enter into a financial agreement to take on new debt payments, we have to make sure that we have the revenue coming in to sustain those payments.
So Rachel, to what extent is, because we're financed largely by sales taxes, is the difficulty of getting getting loans from vendors? I mean, like, my understanding is that if we, for example, I'm not suggesting this, if we had a property tax, which is considered to be more reliable, it's easier to borrow money on that than it is on sales.
It is, it opens up new funding sources for us, plus it's also a more dependable stream of revenue. And we're gonna get more into that when we get into the budget presentation. That's one of the recommendations for capital projects. You cannot enter into a general obligation bond unless you have a property tax. But not all of this would be sales tax based. We do fund a lot of our capital projects through sales tax, but we also have the enterprise funds, water, sewer, and stormwater, which are funded by user fees and have to be run as businesses. So the only way to fund, or the best way to fund capital projects in those funds are through our water rates, our sewer rates, our stormwater rates, and impact fees.
So back to the matrix.
Yes.
I want to say great, that I think the matrix is great. I have two comments.
Okay.
The first is that ranking with sustainability gave me pause. Only in that I thought, I just want all projects to be baseline sustainable. So I'd rather not have a project that rates at a 50 as opposed to 100. Does that make sense? I want all of our projects to be, to have sustainability elements built into them. Does that make sense to everyone? Just like as a baseline, rather than putting it in the matrix. Like, and I understand why you did it. It's more of like a philosophy question for all of us. Like, I just want to make sure that like what we're doing now and forevermore is not going to be harmful, but is going to be not only sustainable, but regenerative in Moab. And so I just wasn't sure about adding it as a ranking thing. Like, I don't want to be 25% sustainable with the project. The example that was given to me that's pretty harsh, but I'll use it, is like this idea of less bad, a project that's less bad. When we think of, you know what, I'm not going to use the example because it's just a horrible one. It's domestic violence, and I don't want to do that.
So are you saying, Mayor, we should just remove sustainability as a criteria because it should just meet a certain criteria and it shouldn't be even a weighted issue?
It should be a mandatory instead of a like optional criteria.
I don't think it's optional. I like it in there because it communicates to the public that is an important goal to us. I agree with the philosophy that they all should just meet a sustainability criteria up front, but I think that shows the public that we are serious about it and that we consider it with every project. So I'm not in favor of taking it out.
Well, then what about increasing its weight to be more like 20% than just 5%?
So my thought about it is that it doesn't differentiate between like a sustainability focused project and another infrastructure project that has a few sustainability features as add-ons, but the bulk of the budget is going basically to stuff that would be purchased anyway, asphalt, pipes, concrete, versus something that's really like focused, like maybe a non-grant funded photovoltaic project. And this doesn't seem to differentiate between that, and some of that is maybe just in the interpretation that staff does when they're applying this and how the intent that we steer them towards. My other thought is that I would want to go back to the sustainability plan that's before us and think about it, because it seems like there's a bunch of goals, but there's not necessarily hierarchy in there, and I would tend to rank their importance differently, but this matrix doesn't address a sustainability goal. And
So
so
what would you do, what would you change in the matrix then, based on what you just said?
I don't have a ready solution. Just,
Well, if I may, I'll put in my 2 bits. Most of these capital projects, first of all, which is kind of different character than day-to-day recycling, if you will. And sustainability to me is more like, often it's kind of engineering decisions make. I mean, when Chuck's building roads, for example, he's going to pick a material that he thinks will last for a long time. And if he has a choice in it, he may well pick a material that, everything else being equal, results in less toxic waste to manufacture, for example. And in that sense, it can fit into sustainability criteria. But I'm comfortable with what Rachel and Joel have done so far, listing it that way. I mean, it does matter, but in the category of capital projects, I wouldn't let it overrule everything else.
It's a very complex idea to try and fit into the matrix. The models we were using didn't include it. We actually, of everything we were looking at, didn't even have sustainability. We actually included it and then tried to work it into how we thought it could work. And we've kind of had a lot of these similar discussions you guys are now having. It's complex, and how, you know, like how do we define it? How are we using it? If we're talking about a pavement project and we're gonna go repave Center Street, but, you know, blacktop's not the best sustainable project. So are we talking that if it's not 100% sustainable, and so is that roll blacktop out? Or is that, how do we regulate where that threshold is? That's kind of where, as a staff, we were struggling. And we thought when we brought this to you guys that this was the area that we were like, we're not quite sure how to implement this. And so I'm glad you guys fell to it, because it's the one area that we really needed some guidance on.
Oh, I think that's a good example. I think Blacktop is a good example of a project that's less bad.
Yeah.
You know, there are surface materials that are more sustainable than asphalt.
Yeah.
But do they align with those other criteria? I mean, that some of them are much more expensive. That
Yep.
blacktop might be the best solution in that situation, and it may not be as sustainable as something else. But
Yeah, the roads is the main area where we were like, this is tough on how we actually want to use the sustainability model for this.
Joel, pardon me if you guys already said this, and I'm just asking a question to restate it. But so I understand the benefit of the matrix, and in some ways it seems like standalone. But is the idea that there would be some crossover, like if we pass the sustainability action plan and we determined our priorities for the coming year, and you know, some of those were very clearly crossing over with capital stuff. Is there a point where, yes, we prioritize these, but maybe one or two of the top things on there, if we had a hard choice to make between one or two, might influence this then? I mean, beside the percentage ranking it had for sustainability?
Well, I
I
guess-
guess I'm just trying to figure out kind of what the mayor's saying. Like, I think we all agree we want all departments to integrate sustainability. We're probably trying to figure out how, but that should be a given. So I'm just trying to understand, if we came up with a list for the sustainability action plan of the, 5 main things or whatever we were prioritizing financially for the next year, if there was logical crossover, and I can't think off the top of my head what that would be, but I could see it would happen if there's any other discussion, or if this matrix should stand alone.
I guess what I would say is, with the sustainability plan, if you identify like 5 targets or 5 goals that you would like every project to address, and if they can't address it, they'll say why they can't address it. That process could actually happen before the project's submitted to go through the rating and ranking process. So once the priority is set by council that we want every project to contain a sustainability component, or one of these 3 or one of these 5, then that would be happening during the project planning phase, where they're actually proposing the project and putting it together.
So my only other question, without creating too much work, is so these are great examples, and so is the idea that we pass the matrix and you guys go through and you evaluate all the projects, that the report on each project would kind of look like this. it would have this breakdown. So my only request was, if it wasn't too much work, would it be possible, like after the title of the project, 100 West Reconstruction, to just have a few sentences to remind some of us who are forgetful, okay, this is in a snippet, is to remind you what this project is exactly, and then I don't know if it's too much work, but I was thinking, like in the example of sustainability here, what might help me, but I mean, it can be in conversation too, is since it was determined this aligned with one sustainability goal, would it be easy to put like in parentheses what that one was? Just because I can guess, but I wouldn't necessarily,
So,
yeah.
totally following in your
Yeah.
line. If we look at the strategic alignment, number 3, in the matrix, that does say the project's alignment with strategic goals as set out in departmental master or strategic plan, and it could also include and sustainability plan. So we could actually make sure that that we have strategic alignment with our plans as we're passing our sustainability plan. If that frees up 5%, I was just gonna throw out too, my other comment was going to be that I feel like financing plays a bigger role than 15%. And I would huck 5% up in financing, only because if we have like Center Street Gym and the Cane Creek projects, and we're like, gosh, which do we choose from? But then we get a $5 million grant to rebuild that thing. Well, you can want to do one, but you got the money to do the other.
Yep.
So I feel like weighting the financing maybe could be more like that. We could hit the strategic alignment, the sustainability goals with our strategic alignment, but then make sure that like every project gets a green light from our sustainability director.
Rachel, can you scroll down so we can see item 3 then, number 3, there. So, Mayor, we'd include that right there, number 3, like you're saying, and then the idea to me that creates, the idea to me that creates as well is it puts the sustainable plan on the same level, the sustainability plan on the same level as our general and master planning, and I think that may be a better signal to the public how important it is to us, rather than it being 5 points down on the bottom. It's like, no, it's right here with our other major planning scenarios that we're using, and it's up here towards the top, and so.
So Joe, could you just not, Emily, would this make you happy, just say directly in line with general plan, master plan,
And sustainability plan.
or sustainability plan?
That would make me happy, and then again, happier would be to
Take out
take that 5% and put it in the financing.
No, I didn't say that.
No, oh, you want to put that in strategic alignment?
Well, I put it in strategic alignment if you want. I mean, 'cause if you don't bump that up there, then, yeah.
Well, I wanted to propose a little more weight on financing anyway. I feel like 15% might, I just know that when I think of like buying a new car, budgeting for my family, we might be like, gosh, let's wait, let's save for our down payment, and then we'll finance the rest of it for a new car. But then if life were to happen and somebody said, hey, this person is giving us $20,000, I'd be like, time's right for the car, because we've got the money to buy it.
I would say also, Mayor, that as we move into the budget presentation, that at this point in our financial position, I agree that financing should carry a higher weight. If at some point in the future our budget looks differently and our financial situation looks differently, then it may not be as a heavily weighted component. But right now, financing is a huge piece, because if there's money available that we're not indebted to pay, that should count for more in the overall.
I think so. And maybe that can be well, that's the way that you've valued that as well, financed entirely from external sources. Oh, the second one is financed entirely from external sources, right?
Yes, and
No
the first one
financing.
is if we have to proceed immediately or we'll lose those funds.
Right, and it seems like with financed entirely from external sources, it seems like a no-brainer, except I also get the impression that just staff capacity to manage capital projects
that's the
is a limitation, and is that implicit in one of more of these categories, or is that Because it seems like it does come into sort of at least the sequencing of them, if not a prioritization.
It does, I guess.
I would say it does. I would say it comes into the first category, the project category, where that point system, you're looking at the top, essential projects, this category includes capital projects that have legal, safety, regulatory. Those are the type of projects that, if they're rating that high on the scale, that our staff that we have, those are the type of things that, obviously, those are going to spend our time and focus working on those projects. And so I think that's somewhat included in that project category of how to categorize them.
I agree, and I would also say at the point that we present that list to city council, as staff, we'd be making a recommendation to say, here's what we feel we can accomplish next budget year or the next 2 budget years. We can't do 20 projects, but of the projects we have rated and ranked, we feel that we can accomplish 5, for example.
Can I just make sure I'm clear? So is the proposal to take that 5% and either add it to financing or split it between strategic alignment and financing? I just didn't know what the suggested change was, so I know what I'm agreeing
suggesting
to.
to put full 5% was
So
to-
can I,
That's
so
what I'm suggesting.
if, to run with both your ideas, if you took the 5% of sustainability and you added it into strategic alignment, where Mike said, you could take the community economic impact, which is currently at 5%. You could fold that community economic impact idea with the risk assessment idea. They're very similar. Leaving that at 15% and take that 5 out of the community and economic impact and put that in the finance if you wanted to move that. Because those are the strategic alignment and, or excuse me, the risk assessment and the community and economic impact are similar.
That makes sense to me.
That works for me, too.
Yeah, me too.
And I agree with
Workshop.
Rachel and Emily that at this point, financing has to play a little bit more
No, so this
of a role. And then along with financing, we have to, as a council, have to use a little common sense and
Thanks, Ronnie. Thank you.
make sure that if some money does come from somewhere, that we're not so married to this matrix that we say, oh, we did this project. We have to be able to say, this can be fluid.
Yes.
So on the row 6, cost benefit, I'm wondering, how do you generate a positive, so I understand that like sewer, water, and stormwater, there's impact fees. So say with 100 West, you're just planning on new development to pay into those to, I mean, it seems like with our capital improvement plans, we kind of plan out how things are going to get paid for based on projections and allocation of costs. But for streets, I'm not sure how that works with this project.
So we weren't looking at it in terms of direct revenue offsets as far as new funds coming into the city. We were looking at it more from the position of lowered maintenance costs or decreased infrastructure repair for failing infrastructure, energy savings costs. So it would be, if there's a road that we're spending, I'm just making up numbers here, $20,000 per year to maintain, but we can replace this segment for $100,000. That payback would be 5 years. How long would the road last? So would the return on investment exceed over the life of the project? As far as generating revenue, most of our infrastructure, we're not dealing so much with expanding infrastructure as we are replacing infrastructure. Right. That's most of our projects right now. So I'm having a hard time thinking of any projects right off that would bring in additional revenue. So the return on investment was really more reduced costs rather than inflow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
Well, and one thing that we might find in putting a project through the matrix, like Center Street Gym, is, 28.25% is a pretty low matrix score. And maybe at that point we say, maybe we need to go back to the drawing board, that maybe the ADA improvements are actually not scoring well, and maybe reconsidering, the bigger conversation we were having as a council about the Center Street Gym. Like, if it's scoring low in the matrix, maybe that's also a trigger to say, maybe we need to reconsider that project. So I think that the matrix is kind of helpful with that too.
And at any time when we present the prioritized list to council, that's not set in stone. So council can also change those priorities based on needs in the community or based on priorities of the council. Obviously, that's the structure that we're presenting so that you have an initial list to work with. But the way we present it is not necessarily the way that it is going to be adopted.
It's a good tool.
But I mean, but looking at the matrix, if I was to look at Aggie Boulevard, I mean, like 40%, that seems like a very low priority project to do. But then, I mean, we had an intergovernmental agreement that we were bound to make happen. So where is that? I mean, I don't know how many more of those projects we're gonna have in the future, but I mean, we had an obligation.
Right, if we had had a process like this in place prior to that obligation, then it's possible that we would have come back and said, we're sorry, but our funds are allocated for the next 5 years. We
Right.
have to push that literally down the road. So for existing obligations that we have, those are just already set. We already have those obligations.
But, you know, a testament to that project in particular, if that could be an example of potential revenue if there's commercial built up there for the city.
But then the commercial would have gone slower because the commercial would have had to pay for it.
Right, so I mean, that would be a higher percentage that we are gonna get a return on investment.
Right.
So, I mean, I don't know how.
And we would say that to the university and the developers, like, hey, this project's gonna rank a lot better and get more fun, you know, get going if you pay for it.
And with the changes you recommended, and once we start using it, it's that type of use that we'll have to start realizing as we're using it. Like has to be calculated in as well.
Right. Okay.
But that one was a tricky one because we looked at it and went, oh, it scored kind of
Really low.
But if we had been sitting down doing this process and Aggie Boulevard was just presented as a project without that obligation, that's how it would have scored.
Gotcha, okay.
If you guys could clarify for me, so what I thought I heard suggested was to take category 9, sustainability, and add it basically into strategic alignment, and then take, that one's okay. But then, you were also gonna take category 8, community and economic impact, which is the kind of thing that Karen just brought up, like USU and so forth, which has a potential revenue generation, and it's synergistic with more with strategic alignment. I guess, I'm sorry, let me try to make it clearer. If we mix risk assessment, category 4, with community and economic impact, category 8, they seem to me to be two different birds. This, category 8, for example, is impact on businesses and economy in terms of revenue generation, which is fine, but it's not the same thing really as 4, which is address, mitigate risk to public health or occupational safety. That's a fairly narrow category and rather distinct, I think, from generating jobs and revenue and stuff like that. So I'm not sure I'm comfortable mixing those two categories. I might well keep them separate.
And that's entirely up to you guys. I mean, if that was just a way to move the points to get the points to work how we were talking, if you want to keep them separate, that's your guys' call. They are different ideas, but they overlap to a degree. Obviously, employment benefits, cost, that all affects health. Like they do to a degree overlap. And if we are providing something that gives someone a better paying job, a better benefits, that affects their day-to-day life and their day-to-day health. So they do to some degree overlap, but they are separate. They're separate ideas for sure.
Can I make a comment towards that? I understand what Mike's saying, and also the point that Kaylin had brought up, as well as Karen, which was if it does increase revenue, so would it make more sense for community and economic impact to maybe be incorporated into the cost benefit payback?
Possibly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And then that makes it 15%.
Well, I mean, we could include
Which
community
weights
and
it higher?
economic impact as cost benefit, and then if you wanted to, you could still move that 5% into financing. So we would be.
Well, the sustainability would move to financing.
Okay.
By the way, Mayor, I do agree with Rachel and staff that financing is a big thing right now, and considering the financial straits that we're in. So, and in general, a lot of staff is putting a lot of time into this, and I'm reluctant to dork around with it too much, if you
Yep.
will.
Yeah. I have a little bit of concern still about 8, just because we don't want to do growth for growth's sakes. It really needs to be quality growth. We have limitations here, and it needs to be living wage job creation and, yeah.
Would that address, partially address the concern if it was combined in with cost benefit payback, or even more?
So you would want to just, I mean,
Join
make it
8
more
with
clear
6.
with job creation, not just any sort of job,
Right, and I'm
like
not-
more
Yeah,
defined as to.
like what sort of growth do we want?
So by
And that's
combining
big-
6 and 8, that gives that the idea of good paying jobs and cost benefits, 15%.
Well, it seems like by separating out 8, we're ascribing some value to community and economic development separate from just the cost benefit payback to the city. Whereas it seems like, that's my interpretation, is 6 is just about, like, what's the ROI for the city organization? Whereas 8 is more about, like, if we can do things to facilitate good things in the community regardless of their direct anticipatable payback to the city, that's still a worthwhile thing to consider.
Were you thinking of the 6-8 combination as 10% total? Only because I had us using the 5% from 8 and the 5% from 9 to go up financing and up strategic alignment. So if somebody has different numbers, just let me know what they are.
No, that's what I was,
Okay.
Oh, okay.
You know what, it almost seems like cost benefit and economic impact are measurable. And when you add the word community impact in there, it becomes a little bit emotional.
Or value-driven or moral-driven.
Yeah, yeah. So all of this is aimed at our community in general. Maybe we just take that word out, and then we have measurable items that we can combine. I don't know. It's just, that was just the thought off the top of my head. It's hard to measure a community impact.
Yeah, but I was
I
having
mean-
the same response to the job creation. I feel like depending on what your leans are,
Yeah,
you'll tend to, it's subjective, because people will say, oh, we're
Exactly.
going to do this and it's going to be great for the community, and yet my understanding is that the reality is that new infrastructure, it's difficult to get it to pay for itself.
yeah.
And I guess that also kind of goes back to talking about the fact that financing has more of an importance right now. Community and economic impact at the point that we're at really isn't as determining of a factor, because we're working on replacing infrastructure. So replacing infrastructure wouldn't, this came from the template that we originally had. Community and economic impact to me would be more for new infrastructure or expanded infrastructure. So I agree that it's going to depend on the perspective of what type of growth that we want, but the point that we're at financially now, to me, it would make sense to maybe eliminate that category and the 5% somewhere else until we're at a point that we are looking at expanding our infrastructure.
Well, except for like with the north trunk line, that seems like a direct correlation to the community and economic impact on our community. I mean.
It goes without saying that it impacts the community, but it's also, we'll also be able to measure what it does and what it makes better. I think it's just, when I think about the word community, it's a little more emotional, and that's the best way I can describe it, as opposed to, it's a cosmetic desire versus a domestic need, I guess, you know?
Well, it seems like the same matrix that is used for community contributions. I mean, like, you're trying to weigh,
Yeah.
that feels the same right there. So I don't know that that's a bad thing though, especially in our discussions with our
Yeah.
overnight accommodations. I mean, this is directly related.
Well, I'm glad to hear that perhaps it's not going to be so much of a focus in the near future, and maybe it won't play that much in terms of the test driving that'll happen over the next few years.
And I would say this matrix should be updated probably every 2 to 3 years, because as our financial situation changes, our priorities are changing on how we want to rate and rank projects based on available funding. And I don't want to stop conversation by any means, but I was hoping we could reserve about 45 minutes for the budget.
Right. So are we all in agreement that we would like financing to be at 20% instead of 15?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the, like, definite. So we need to take 5% from somewhere. It's so weird, like, I don't want to eliminate sustainability as part of a matrix, but at the same time, again, I feel like eliminating 9, including the sustainability plan, and the number 3 gives us the opportunity to take that 5% and give it to financing.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's fine.
I agree.
And so would we make that clear that it's just strategic and sustainability?
It would be, yeah, the strategic
Yeah.
alignment, like Kaylin said, would be master plan.
No, I'm just saying in the title, should we make it clear that we're including that in that
Strategic and
and sustainability
I think-
alignment?
No, I like the idea of
Yeah,
being
yeah,
okay.
yes,
Okay.
yeah.
still strategic alignment, but as I suggested, this, just add sustainability directly aligned with general plan, master plan, sustainability plan, is that
I think we can just include it in the description of,
okay?
I think so.
I suggest upping it to 15%. Take the 5 out of number 8.
Out of number 8?
And then number 8 just doesn't have,
Either
It
you
goes
take
away.
Rachel's suggestion of taking it away, or you wrap it into number 6, but the total is 10 for number 6 and number 8 combined, if you combine them.
This is a separate deal you're talking about. Okay.
I agree with you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that works.
You want to take 8 and move it into 6? I'm sorry, is that right? Take its 5, okay, so tell me then which one.
It's what we were discussing earlier, so.
Okay, I've got notes on that.
Or, I mean, I'm okay taking 8 out now too. I don't, whatever the group wants. I just don't think it needs, that 5% as much as strategic
Okay,
alignment
so
does.
eliminating lines 8 and 9.
Okay,
Sustainability goes up into the line 3, strategic alignment.
all right.
Community and economic impact gets folded into line 6, cost
Okay,
benefit.
that's what I thought, okay.
And that those two percentages, 5% is then attributed to 3, strategic alignment, and 5, financing.
Yes, I've got it.
Everybody feel good?
All
right.
All right, that's fine.
Let's bite off the budge.
Thank you.
It.
So what's in your packet for next week is this matrix, so I will modify it, email it out to you, and then have it at the meeting on Tuesday.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Is
you.
there a way to modify the documents online so that if somebody wants to look at the matrix?
The whole packet and amend the packet. I mean, we can do it. You just let me know what you want to do.
I don't know if it matters.
Okay, welcome to our budget discussion.
Oh, we could add it, though, as a, on our questions. The new document could be a link. We could add that link. Questions?
So the intention is to discuss the updated strategic plan that you are going to update?
The matrix,
That's what I mean, the matrix.
yes. Which is already posted on the agenda. It's just the materials that are in there don't reflect the changes that were just made.
We'll figure it out.
Okay.
So welcome to the budget discussion. This will probably look familiar to all of you since we had this discussion with you individually a couple of weeks ago.
And this, you pulled this up from where?
From my secret place. From,
My back pocket.
from Smart Sheets. It's not posted currently online,
Okay,
so.
got it.
Oh, sorry, you have it on your computer. I see.
Well, I just, sometimes I like to look at stuff after. So I'm gonna pull it up.
I will, so the previous budget discussion was shared with each of you, and you could pull that up in Smart Sheets, and I've made some changes, so it still should be shared with you. So individually, you can still pull it up later if you want to go back and drill down on any of the numbers. So part of this is review for the council and also for the public. This is just our revenue portfolio across the city, showing you where our revenues come from. 51% come from sales-based taxes. When I say sales taxes, people think just sales tax alone, but it includes resort community, highway tax, transient room tax, transportation tax. User fees represent 33%. That includes all user fees, including utility customers, so water and sewer rates, recreation fees, fees that are paid into the general fund for services. Impact fees are 5.72%. Right now, we only collect impact fees in the water and sewer funds. Other revenue, which includes things like grants, donations, one-time funding. Transportation tax is included with Class C. So we get a Class C allotment, which is also a sales-based tax that the state collects and then distributes out to all municipalities that have Class C roads. And the transportation tax that was adopted 4 or 5 years ago. Licenses and permits, the bulk of that generally are building permits, commercial and residential building permits, and intergovernmental, which represents interlocal agreements that we have with other government agencies. And this is just operations, so it doesn't include any intergovernmental agreements that we have for capital, which we only have one, which is for the Aquatic Center. Property taxes on there as a 0, and this was modeled after the Utah League of Cities and Towns. They basically have a revenue portfolio they put together to demonstrate how cities collect taxes, and that was put together as part of the tax reform. How we fund our current budget for this current budget year, FYE is fiscal year ending, so we're in fiscal year ending 2020 right now. Here is the history of sales-based taxes and expenditures, and you'll see this trend throughout the presentation, but blue are sales-based tax revenues, red are the expenditures that are dependent on sales-based taxes. So that you can see back to fiscal year 16, our expenditures have been exceeding our revenues, which has necessitated that we have been funding operations out of reserves. This shows our annual trend and what portion of our total sales-based tax revenue each of those taxes makes up. So that you can see that resort community is the majority that we bring in, TRT a smaller portion, highway. And then the sales and use tax, so that's our local option, the 1%. We get a 0.5% back from the state. That other 0.5% is distributed across the state based on population. So even though we have a local 1%, we don't receive that entire 1%. We get a 0.5% off the top, and then the other 0.5% is distributed based on permanent population. This shows the same trend for the sales tax expenditures, showing each proportionate share for departments. This I'm just going to show you briefly. This was a handout I put together for the debate team when they were debating sales tax reform, which was a lot of fun. But this just shows under our current tax structure, the tax rate that's applicable to different types of sales and who the recipient of those sales tax funds are, whether it's the state, the city, or the county.
Rachel, can I just ask a side question? So given some of the stories we've been seeing about possible changes in food taxes, I mean, I know it's still early, so we don't really know if that's gonna happen or not, but do you have a gut feeling if that's probably headed that way, and that's probably gonna change that percentage, right?
I haven't changed the
Yeah.
percentage.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
where we're at right now.
Yeah.
I don't. I attended quite a few of the tax restructuring task force hearings, and I can tell you that the public was not in favor. The people that spoke at those meetings were not in favor of restoring the full sales tax to food. It is a regressive tax, so it has a much larger impact on those at the lower end of the income scale. They're trying to propose offsetting that with a state tax credit. However, you would only receive that state tax
At the
credit
end,
if you
right?
filed
Yeah.
taxes.
Aren't there a lot of folks that don't, there's a certain minimum below which you don't have to file? And those, I know,
Correct.
because one of my relatives is in that boat.
And that also depends on your citizenship status.
So, I mean, that's not only the extra administrative hazard, but a lot of people who are not used to filing would be precisely the ones who would have to file.
They would miss out on that credit, yes.
Well, it doesn't help you to be credited later for money you never had in the first place. But anyway, okay, I didn't want to digress, but I was just
Oh,
trying
that's
to
okay.
prepare myself for how likely we thought that was.
I'm eager to see how that progresses through the legislature. The draft bill hasn't been released yet, but they were also coupling that with broadening the base. And I think based on the meetings I attended, they're going to get a lot of pushback about broadening the base. So if the two are coupled together, it
Oh, I thought the draft bill was published.
I haven't seen the draft bill yet.
And it's going to change drastically between now and April.
But like the original draft, the one that we're talking
Proposal.
about, the proposal, yeah.
Yes,
Oh,
but
so
it's
you're
not in bill form yet.
right,
Yes.
got it, thank you.
Okay. Sorry, Smart Sheets is awesome for charts, but it's a little clunky for navigation. Just
Oh,
looking-
and I just want to just say, just a point to that, that with the League of Cities and Towns, the message is, hey, cities, it doesn't appear that cities were adversely affected by the sales tax changes that were proposed. However, there are some other things, so there might be different organizations, not the League of Cities and Towns, but other organizations that you might want to reach out to. If you're concerned about the decrease in income tax going to schools, then you might want to reach out to, people that are involved in lobbying on the school board side. If you're interested about the penalizing lower income individuals because of the increase in food, then there are advocacy groups and lobbyists that are working on that as well.
Yeah, I
But
didn't know
just-
if we as a group were going to have time before the legislative session to,
I
kind
think
of
we
come
will
to
have
some,
time,
yeah,
and we
because
can,
I'm guessing for our community and how many people are at risk. Yeah, the food one doesn't sound like a
And
good thing
so-
for our community, yeah.
so what we should do is look to those different organizations that are doing that work that might have shared statements that we can look at as a group.
Okay. So as we looked at those increases in operational expenses, this just breaks it down by function. And I'd like to say at this point that you can see the trend, and you can also see the years in which goals and priorities changed based on change in administration, change in governing body. And so operations were expanded in order to accommodate those change. Former city manager referred to it as expanding our bandwidth. So we didn't have bandwidth to take on the goals and priorities at that time. Operations started to expand after fiscal year 16. General government, for example, total was just under 2 million, and general government in this year's budget is about 3.6 million. And then this breaks it up across the other departments. Some departments were broken out. Human resources, for example, previously wasn't a department. It was included in the recorder function, so you can see recorder went down, and then human resources was added. And all of these charts that I've shared with you, you can click on them and it takes you through to the spreadsheets that contain the data. Public safety shows you the differences in the public safety departments during that same time frame. Public Works, non-utility, so since these are sales tax dependent expenditures, you don't see water, sewer, and stormwater because those are just by user fees. Community services, operations, again, you can see as new development came in and priorities changed. Planning, for example, we increased planning staff to meet the demands of those services. Recreation is largely dependent on sales tax because of the subsidy that goes from the general fund over to the recreation fund, and you can see similar increases in the recreation fund. So that's just kind of a informational background to get us into the meat of the budget discussion. So citywide operations, let me go back on the big screen. And we haven't really taken a look at this before, but when you're looking at the city as a whole, including enterprise funds, and how those operations are paid for, you can see the chart on the left, 64%, including the cost of the enterprise fund, comes from sales-based taxes. This budget year, we're using a total of 7% of our reserves. 26% is coming from user fees, and whenever we can offset a service or a cost with a user fee, that's a direct reimbursement, so that works out well. 2% intergovernmental, 1% grants and donations. That's the operations side. When we look at capital projects, you can see that this particular year, 43% is coming from new debt or from project borrowing, 31% from grants and donations. That piece of the pie is particularly large this year because of the $8 million coming from UDOT for hotspot funding. So I would love to see 31% of our capital projects being paid by grants each year, but that's generally not the case. This was a one-time project that we were very excited to get. 18% coming from reserves. It makes sense, like in the example that you gave of buying a car, that you save up so that you can pay a portion of a capital project expense with cash. So this is where we should be using our reserves, and 3% from sales-based taxes. The 1% intergovernmental right there is in part the contribution from the Special Service Recreation District for the debt retirement on the Aquatic Center. So now when we talk about how each department is funded, of the total bucket of sales-based taxes that we bring in revenue, this is how we spend it. 28% goes to general government, 28% to public safety, 21% to non-enterprise public works. No sales tax dollars go to utility funds, to water, sewer, stormwater. We'll see that in a minute, but that's not included in this pie. I'm not going to go through each percentage, but that just kind of gives you an idea of when you look at the amount that we bring in sales tax, this is where we spend those funds. This was kind of eye-opening to me as well. This was a new analysis that I did that just shows by function. So when you look at the general government function, how is that being funded in this budget year? So again, 85% of the budget for general government, which is $3.6 million, is coming from sales-based taxes, but 9% of that operational cost is coming from reserves this year. So when you see that red piece of the pie through each of these charts, that's the amount that we are in effect taking out of our savings account to, for lack of a better analogy, pay our electricity bill, pay our gas bill. So we are operating out of our savings, which is not sustainable. And we're going to talk more about that as we get further in. Public works, non-utility, you would expect to see that mainly from sales tax because we don't have user fees for public works. Community services, the largest piece other than sales tax there, user fees, that represents building permits. The housing fund, I'm pleased to say, is 100% funded by user fees. So there is currently no sales tax funding going towards our housing project, and that's the way we'd like to keep it. Here are our enterprise funds, and you can see the pie's the same color except for water. So This is what you would expect to see, because since we run them as businesses, they should be supporting themselves. They should not be drawing from reserves to fund operations. Our rates that we're setting for our ratepayers should completely cover the cost of operations. The water fund, unfortunately, this year was budgeted at a loss. So 4% of the operational cost of the water fund, $53,000, is coming out of our reserves. And we're going to look at our reserves here in just a minute and see why specifically for the water fund that is a big issue. So this shows how we have budgeted in the past, back to, I thought it would be helpful to try and go back almost 10 years. Red representing expenditures, green representing revenue, which just occurred to me, looks a little Christmassy there. And then down at the bottom, total reserves. And this is, again, just operational. And the total reserves that we're looking at is either if we contribute into our reserves or if we're using our reserves. So you can see back in fiscal year 12, our revenue exceeded our expenditures, and we actually were contributing. We were contributing into the capital projects fund so that we could build that reserve to help pay cash for some of our capital projects. This year, fiscal year 15, we had a wider gap there, and we actually contributed 1.9 million into the capital projects fund. This is where the streams crossed.
Is there a max that could be contributed each year?
There is. You can have 25% of your total general fund revenues in your fund balance in the general fund. So once you exceed that amount, you have to transfer it out to another, where you get a finding from the state auditor.
Gotcha.
But there's also a minimum that you have to keep in there, and we're going to look at a chart that shows what that minimum is.
Okay.
So in fiscal year 18, that is when our expenses exceeded our revenues. And for the last two budget cycles, our expenditures are above our revenues, which is why this number dips below zero. You can't really tell that on the graph, but fiscal year 19, we budgeted to use $1 million to fund operations. At the end of the year, when everything balanced out, we ended up using $800,000 out of our reserves to fund operations. For this budget year, we still have that gap. And this budget year, we have budgeted to use 1.1 million out of the general fund reserve to fund operations. And again, that's daily operations, that's not capital costs. So ideally, we want to get these lines back to this configuration where expenses are lower, revenues are higher. This is how we budgeted this year. If you think of each fund as sustaining itself, so this isn't the bottom line of the fund, but general fund, for example, if the revenues coming into general fund just had to support the operations in general fund, then the general fund would have generated $296,759 this year. When you look at the general fund budget, that's not the actual amount because we transfer to the recreation fund. We transfer over $800,000 to the recreation fund from sales-based taxes to subsidize. But if you looked at the fund like it was a business by itself, this is what it would have generated this year. Class C went negative, $4,000. Recreation, and again, when we sat down individually, as I said, recreation never operates at a profit or a gain. It is a service that's identified as being important to the community, so it is subsidized. So we would never expect to see recreation break even because the cost of providing those services, we can't charge enough to the community to cover that. Trails, negative $190,000, that came out of general fund reserves. Housing, $98,000 positive, which was good. Water was budgeted at a negative $53,000 at a loss, which since we have total control over our rates, that's something that generally we shouldn't do. Sewer, $142,000. With both water and sewer, they should be generating enough at the end of the year that that can go towards a capital project. So these numbers actually need to be much higher so that we can be funding capital projects in the water and sewer fund. And stormwater, $101,000. This is similar to the trend that we saw when we looked at revenue and expenditures, and This is just the trend of the revenues.
Can we go back up? I just want to make a comment, and maybe it's because Chief is sitting in the room, which actually makes me very happy to have certain staff in the room with us as we're talking about budget. So like with recreation, we're saying like we provide this big service recreation. We're taking some money in, but not enough to cover the cost.
Correct.
When we think about public safety, like there's no amount of like ticket that our officers can collect to generate the money that it would take to run the force. But we're not looking at that in this chart. So why are we breaking out recreation?
I guess part of the theory there is that a large part of the population that public safety serves are our tourist population, and the tourists are paying the bulk of the sales tax that come into the general fund. So when we looked at that pie for public safety, you could see how much of it was funded by sales tax. Recreation services are generally, our customer base is permanent residents.
Okay. So that's the distinction.
Yes.
Okay.
So while it's not a direct revenue source, as in public safety does not generate money, the users of the public safety system are paying money into the sales tax that then funds the general government functions.
Okay.
So where are we for next year's budget? All of our sales-based taxes are not only 100% committed, but they also do not cover our current operating expenses. We cannot continue to fund operations out of reserves. As you'll recall, the debt management policy that you adopted in September said that we would not do that for a period of more than 2 years. We drew the line in the sand at the point that you adopted it. However, we have been funding out of reserves for the past 3 years, which means that our reserves are just about depleted. Let's look at what our reserves currently look like. So this is this budget year, and this is the amount that we have budgeted to use out of reserves by fund. So again, general fund, we've budgeted to pull $1 million, Class C, 4,200, recreation. Even with the subsidy from the general fund and the intergovernmental contribution, we're still drawing $117,000 out of their reserves to fund operations. Capital projects, that's where you should be pulling money from reserves for capital projects, so that number should be large. However, we're going to look at the fund balance in the capital projects and why we are not able to do that next year. Water and sewer, also sizable. Stormwater, that's mainly attributable to the payment to UDOT for the 191 widening for Stewart Canyon. The bulk of the sewer contribution is for the north area sewer. And then health insurance, yay, is budgeted to contribute to their fund balance, and that is our self-funded health insurance that keeps our premium costs low because we cover some of the liability of our own claims. So our projected reserves at the end of the year, general fund, that looks like...
When you say keep our premium costs low, you mean premium per individual on the plans?
I mean the premium that we pay to our healthcare provider to provide our health insurance.
Is that the bulk of what we, on behalf of the employees?
Yes. The health insurance right now covers our employees. General fund is going to be down to $840,000. And we'll look at a graph of what the minimum amount is we need to keep. Class C, 270. Recreation 152, and keep in mind we pulled 117 this year for operations, so we're going to look at the next chart. What if we budgeted exactly the same way we did this year? CDBG 36, Trails Fund actually started the year negative and is still negative. Housing Fund, we have a fund balance in there for future projects, which is good. Our capital projects fund balance will be at $65,000 at the end of this year, which in effect is depleted. Water will be negative. Sewer will be negative. Stormwater will have $818,000. We have another $1 million payment due to UDOT in the next fiscal year. My hope is that through our stormwater fees, we can get close to that $1 million. Best case scenario for this fund is we don't have to borrow money to make that payment to UDOT. Health insurance is projected at $517,000. And again, that lowers our reinsurance cost if we can maintain a balance in the health insurance fund that covers stop losses for our organization. If we budgeted exactly the same way that we did this year, taking out the big project of hotspot funding from UDOT, because that was one-time funding, and we pulled the same amount from reserves, our general fund balance would be down to 126,000. Class C would be at 265. Recreation 34. CDBG would stay the same. Trails fund still negative. Housing fund, if we budgeted the same way. Our capital projects fund, basically we would not budget for capital projects next year. If we needed the same amount we needed this year, it would put us $800,000 negative, which we can't do. Same with water, no capital projects. Same with sewer, no capital projects. And nothing for stormwater. So,
Excuse me, Rachel.
yes,
One quick question. The 3 enterprise funds,
yes.
I guess I don't understand why the fund balances are so negative. Don't we assess user fees and impact fees and so forth to keep those balances near zero?
We don't want them near zero. We want enough in those fund balances so that we can fund capital projects. This particular chart is just status quo. If we budgeted exactly the same way in 2021 that we budgeted this year, that's what the fund balance would look like. Obviously, we wouldn't do that because we wouldn't take them that far negative. But this illustrates that our rates in the water and sewer fund have not kept up with our operations. The enterprise fund we have total control over. We can set rates so that we are putting money into capital projects and covering operations, but collectively over the past how many ever years, our rates have not kept pace.
Even though we've been people have been complaining about how rates have been raised in the last few years periodically,
Yes.
and they're still not enough. That's
Still
what you're
not enough. Part of that is ascribed to the fact that for a period of about 20 years, there were very few rate increases. We didn't even have inflationary rate increases.
Thank you.
The general fund balance. This red line is the state required minimum. So that is the amount by state law that we are required to have in our fund balance. You can see back to 2009, the fund balance went up and down, which was a function of when we made those significant transfers into the capital projects fund. 2019, from this point, actually, from about this point forward, you'll see in the graph below, we stopped making transfers into the capital projects funds as we started utilizing the reserves or the savings for operations. So for 2020, that's our current fund balance. 2021, we would be projected to be down to 126,000, which would be below the state required minimum. The state required minimum is 5% of our operational revenues in the general fund. One-time use of fund balance, red represents capital projects. So those are the years that we transferred those funds into the capital project fund, versus one-time use, which generally were carryover projects, and often those were studies or consultants that we used for planning. But when we get to 2018, this was subsidizing operations.
That is a tough chart.
Yes, it is. So let's go back down. This just kind of reiterates what I already said, which is historically we have made significant transfers from the general fund to fund capital projects. Any non-enterprise capital project, our funding source is and historically has been sales tax. So at the point that sales tax no longer funds operations, we don't have money for capital projects other than enterprise funds. And as we've demonstrated, our enterprise fund rates have not kept up. So unfortunately, we also don't have money in the enterprise funds for capital projects. So the next step, my recommendation as finance director, is we need to fully fund our daily operations out of our existing revenue. And we need to stabilize operations before we can then move on to capital projects. So you can see the bolded underline, we need to first reduce our operations, and then we need to diversify and increase our revenue sources to address capital projects. Over the next 2 years, we need to reduce our operations by 7% or $1.1 million to fully fund operations with our existing revenue sources and to begin rebuilding our operational reserves. We have to have reserves for operations. We also have to have reserves for capital projects. If we don't have reserve for operations and we have a downturn in the economy, we are completely dependent on sales-based taxes. If our visitation drops, if our sales rate changes, if the state restructures those tax rates, our revenue drops. Then we have no reserve to draw from a rainy day fund for operations.
And some of the TRT that we use as a city, when they were passed in 1998, they had to be associated with the debt you were retiring, or they had a 25-year window. Well, that was in 1998, so we're coming to the end of that 25-year window. We've been working with our legislators and with our representatives to extend that time frame. But as of right now, that the reality that we live in right now is that the additional 0.5% of the TRT we collect will expire in 2023, which is only 2 years away in a fiscal setting. So we're working to expand that tax structure as well. But right now, we have to proceed as if they're not going to, because we haven't heard that they are going to extend it.
Is it possible not to only have the discussion of expansion, but increasing it?
We're having those talks as well, and if not increasing it, other areas where we could create new sources of revenue.
So that 0.5% that Joel referred to in this year's budget would represent $500,000. So at the point that that sunsets, at that point it might be more, but so instead of 1.1 million, we'd be looking at 1.6 million. Go ahead, Mike. Did you have a question?
Yeah, one easy question. So on this nifty little page you got here, this capital projects and long-term debt
Yes.
table, so everything down to sustainability is non-utility capital project requirements, and the ones below it are utility capital projects, is that right?
Yes, so when you look at water, sewer, and stormwater, those are the utility capital
Okay.
projects and utility debt payments.
Thank you.
And sorry, I should have mentioned this sheet. So when we had the individual budget meetings, Ronnie had requested that there was just kind of a one-page kind of talking point or fact sheet. And I don't know if this necessarily addresses it, Ronnie, because there's a lot of numbers on there.
Thank you, this is very useful.
I love stuff on one page, okay? I mean, I do.
So new revenue sources, as we've just discussed, we have no control over the sales tax rate. We do work with the Utah League of Cities and Towns and lobbying to make sure that we can keep the taxes that we currently have. We don't have control over the tax base when the legislature looks at changing that structure. We also don't have control over the volume of local sales. So the economy is still expanding, and if you talk to an economist, they will tell you everything that expands retracts. So economists are predicting in the next several years the economy is going to start to retract. If sales tax starts to go down, we don't have control over that. We can't adjust the sales tax rate. All we have control over are operations. We can implement a RAP tax, a Recreation, Arts, and Parks tax. The state allows us to implement up to 0.1%, which is a point of sale sales tax. That would yield approximately $300,000. That is a direct revenue source for recreation, arts, and parks. You can use it towards operations or capital projects. Bringing that new revenue in would free up existing sales-based taxes that we are currently using for recreation, arts, and parks. So in addition to having a dedicated revenue source for recreation, it would free up in the general fund $300,000 to put towards operations or capital projects. It does require putting it on the ballot. So in order to pass it, it requires a vote of our registered voters.
And that vote would happen in November.
Not necessarily. Yeah, it could be held.
Voted on in the primary, so it could correspond with our budget season.
Yes, that would be the goal.
But we don't have a primary we do with the county.
Yeah.
Would it run with the primary election?
Yeah,
with
it
the
can go on
county?
an election, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, I may have missed it, but that is a sales-based sales tax. That's a tax that is sales-based, so it's not.
Yes.
So it
Mm-hmm.
is the final step to maximize the amount with which we collect sales tax.
Every available sales tax that we have.
It is, yeah.
And for $1 that somebody spends on a hotel room, it would be
0.1%,
0.1 of a penny?
yes.
So it'd be a tenth of a penny, or would it be a penny, or would it be a dime?
Making me do math in the middle of a presentation. My
I'm
brain's
so
seizing
sorry.
up. That's okay.
It's just, when you say implement a RAP tax of 0.1%, if it's 0.1% of a sale,
1% of a sale, so it's
So
not
it's
1%. So if there's
0.1 of a dollar would be a penny.
yes.
So it's a penny per
Per sale, per dollar per sale.
sale.
Yeah.
So that's not a big increase if we present that to the community and say this is just adding the final sales tax. I
And
think.
again, tourists would carry the bulk of that load.
But it's pennies to tourists.
Yeah,
It's not a big, it would not be implementing a big impact to the individual visitor, but it could help us stabilize our recreation services.
the tourists would not notice it. It would make a big difference for us.
So are there categories of impact fees that we could be assessing so that new development pays more of its share?
Yes, and I think Joel would like to speak to that.
Yes, we actually had a staff meeting about that yesterday, and we are preparing an RFP for the impact fees that we do not currently collect, which include stormwater, parks, public safety, there's roads and road facilities. We don't collect impact fees for any of those. Currently, we're collecting impact fees for water and sewer. And so we're only collecting about 33% of what we could be in impact fees. And so we had a staff meeting yesterday. We are in the process. We expect to have the RFP ready for publication next week, and we're hoping to have impact fees here in the next 6 months ready to go for those other developments.
And that's mandatory to get an outside source to do an RFP?
Absolutely. Impact fees are highly regulated. There's Title 11 of the code in Section 36A, and it literally outlines step by step. We have to have public hearings, not one. We have to have 90-day public hearing window. We have to have a 10-day public hearing notice. We have to have public hearing. We have to have to give a public notice before we even start the process.
What's an estimate for that study?
Or dollar?
Dollar-wise. What's our current?
60?
Yeah, probably 50 to 60,000.
Do we have that in our budget, or is that a?
Nope, we're gonna have to go make cuts somewhere to find it, but
Cut.
it's one of those things that we're 18 months to see any of that revenue, because by the time we get it in place and then we start collecting it and then we actually get it, and it's like that time frame never starts until we pony up and figure out how to make that initial payment, so.
Do we have an idea, obviously I know we do, but how much we spent in studies last year?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Oh, you don't want to tell me?
So,
Just a word on impact fees. Impact fees are great. It's a good way for new development to help pay into the system. Keep in mind that impact fees are for capital costs.
Yep.
They can't be used for operations. And impact fees are dependent on new development or new growth. So as the city builds out, eventually those impact fees are going to start to decline. So it's awesome
I
to have
mean,
them in place.
Unless you annex, I mean, there's ways to keep.
Yes.
I mean, there's ways to keep it going, but,
It
yeah.
doesn't address our operational needs.
No, not at all.
But it's good for capital.
Yep, and it will help us with our infrastructure deficit that is exponential.
and we can always look at, if we're gonna implement impact fees, we can look at certain eligibility waivers or reductions, right?
The way our
So if we
current
want
impact
to-
fees are structured, we can't waive them, but the council can choose to pay them.
Nope. That's the way they're currently structured. As we go forward, as a part of the code, when we adopt our impact fee analysis, we can put in there that there are exceptions to impact fees that we can make. Some of them are low-income housing. There's 3 or 4 of them that I can't recall off the top of my head, but yet you can build in the ability to waive impact fees for certain types of project. Low-income housing is one of them. Public schools is another, charter schools
That's
is
what I
another.
was thinking.
So there are some exceptions, but for the most part, the answer is usually no, you can't waive impact fees, but there are some holes.
Okay, because then I think of like the development around USU is our largest chunk of undeveloped.
Yep.
Well, that, and I guess we've got the Mill Creek subdivision. We've got, and maybe some other parcels. And it would be good to know, if we're going into impact fee territory, there are certain things that we want to incentivize in our community being low, probably also moderate income housing.
Yep. And so
And-
as we've looked into this, Mayor, I knew that that would come up, and so I've been doing research on it, and we're gonna make sure that that is in our impact fee
Part of the-
analysis. And it
yeah.
does say low-income housing, the state school district, charter schools, or other development activity with broad public purpose. And I think that we can write it into ours, that we can get that, read that area in there that is a part of that development. We need to get it going.
Wait, so they wouldn't have as high impact?
Now, this is all.
They would all be the same rate, but we would have the opportunity to
Yeah.
pay for or waive
And this is all the 40,000
certain
foot view.
projects.
So would you waive an apartment complex?
I wouldn't waive anything. I would before, hold on.
I appreciate
Before,
that. Yes.
before we're like really high looking down.
Yes.
That all has to go into the impact fee analysis, which has to come to you for approval before we even have that set of rules. Right now, under our current set of rules, we're not allowed to waive them for anything, not even low-income housing. So that will come to you. You guys will look at that. You will approve it. And then if we do a scenario where we're doing a development like that, that would come to you for approval. I would not be comfortable waiving 6 figures in fees. Like, I would not even.
But so what was the number for studies?
I think 50 to 60 is what I heard.
No.
Oh, sorry.
That we spent
Oh,
last year.
oh,
It was beyond that.
Total contracted services for outside consultants was $800,000.
Wow. Okay.
Let me throw this out if I may, Mayor. On the subject of impact fees, and so there's a philosophical, I just want to make it clear, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong. A city can elect to count on growth as a way of future growth, all right, to fund its present-day problems. And a lot of cities do that because it's kind of pushing problems off, but it comes at the cost of, to pick an extreme example, like St. George, for example, and their Lake Powell pipeline. I was sitting in on that discussion up at the state. They're going to have to triple St. George's population, for example, and triple the water rates, blah, 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 just to enjoy this amenity. And they may get their water that way, but it will be at the expense of St. George turning into a different kind of town than it is. So that's a quality of life issue that all the residents will have to participate in, because basically it means we can try to delay growth and try not to depend so heavily on future revenue and having to build new subdivisions or new businesses to pay for that. But it may mean for residents, I think we have an obligation to make it clear to them that that's the trade that they're making, and it may cost them taxes out of their pocket, okay, to enjoy that quality of life. And that's that's a discussion that we want to have, but I want to make it clear that there's that kind of trade. You can either mortgage your future, so to speak, or you can pay for it up front.
I think that's an excellent point, Mike. I think that, we have a duty as a city to rein our belt in and to get our situation corrected, and we will. I'm not even concerned about it. The question then becomes, though, year 2, year 3, going forward, how do we start addressing some of the issues that we've been showing you? And how are we going to pay for those? And there's different ways to pay for them. And one of them is to tax, sales tax and impact fees, and develop and get money in that way and bring in revenue and keep your city running that way. If that's not the quality of life that others want, then the reality is that taxing the home base is the alternative.
Sure.
So we all have probably some hard truths to look at. You can't have it both ways, is the famous saying, right?
But both ways.
Yep.
So along those lines, that brings me to my next bullet point, which is funding capital projects. Our capital project reserves are projected to be depleted by the end of this fiscal year, which means we're in a position that we cannot budget for capital projects next year. Now, when we get to the end of this year, we probably will not have accomplished everything that we have budgeted this year. So there will be some residual funds. However,
The only way we would budget for a capital project is if we had 100% financing from an outside source to be able to
Correct.
pay for it. So we
Yes.
could still do a capital project. We would just have to find outside funding for it.
outside funding would have to be 100% grant. Yes,
Yeah.
because we can't take on any debt right now.
What about with respect to a revenue neutral or being in the black with like a project? So I just think of like Walnut Lane
So housing would actually be separate, because right now there are no sales tax dollars going towards housing. So I'm sorry, I should qualify when I say no capital projects. That's outside of enterprise fund and outside of housing. Housing has a dedicated revenue stream coming in, and the goal with the Walnut Lane project is that it will be self-funded.
So, well, and so projects that are, so then again, the parking structure is 100% grant funded through UDOT. So that's a capital project that's going to happen. Walnut Lane is a revenue neutral project. So that is a project that's going to happen.
Yes.
So it kind of helps us as a council also frame like Cane Creek, you know, that's roads. And that, there's no way we can get a revenue unless we get a grant to redo Cane Creek. It's not going to happen.
Which we're looking at with the FLAP program through the
Once-
federal government.
And once we have impact fees, our proper impact fees in place, we will be collecting an impact fee for roads, but again, that's.
Gotta wait and collect.
And it's new
save.
capacity, it's not redoing old roads,
We're
so.
looking at funding sources for Cane Creek that we're hopeful we'll get.
So there's operations and projects. And you're saying if there's not outside money or revenue neutral, there's no project. Project's not in the matrix because it's not even.
We still
an
want to go
option.
through the exercise of the matrix so that we know what our priorities are, but we have to have the funding in place to achieve those.
And that we're looking at a 7% reduction across the board, or that's a strategy that are you going to present deeper strategy, or do we as a council need to start?
No, we are going to,
Just looking at
we've been working on this for a while. We have plans, we have ideas, we'll present
Because
those.
this is going to get really uncomfortable.
Yes.
And so,
But we are going to present to you guys roadmaps going forward.
but
It's not insurmountable, like, this is not, like, this is not doom and gloom, like, penny henny, the sky is falling and we all need to panic and this is our last day. It was great working here. Good luck with this. It'll be okay,
I'm
but,
still waiting for more personal affects in your office.
yeah, okay.
So
Work on that this weekend. But that said, we do have a plan and we've been working on it and we've spent a lot of time the last 2-3 weeks, especially on this.
So Joel, forgive me, if I was on your staff, I would guess, I mean, I would take, here's a list of departments, so to speak, for the most part, operations departments. And so your first order cut would be, whack everybody, their department budget's 7%. But it's not that simple because some of them have harder, so to speak, requirements than others. A lot of people would argue, for example, police department. And there's no way they can take a 7% cut without serious reductions in public safety, perhaps. And there's another complicating aspect to it. A lot of people in other departments may well say, well, you guys added a world of new people, blah, 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 new here, which is great. Don't get me wrong. I'm delighted to have a terrific administration department, but a lot of the extra expenses are added in here, and then they'll say, well, you guys ought to take the most hit about the whole thing. I don't know. But I mean, discussions sort of go along those lines then? I mean,
Mayor, we're at 11:37. I'm wondering if it's time to exert some, and we're planning to stop at noon and we still have the closed session. Are we doing okay, or does Rachel need to finish and we need to move on?
About 5 more minutes to just.
Oh, really?
It's not that simplistic, Mike. It's hard, you're right.
it's even worse than that. Is that what you're
It's
saying?
hard, and I mean, as we work through it, we're gonna bring you guys a roadmap and bring you options. It won't be you need to do this. It'll be, here's one way you can fix this, here's another way you can fix this, here's another way you can fix this, here's another, like, we're going to make sure you guys have options on how to go forward.
And we're not special or unique. Every municipality
absolutely.
almost is facing
It's cycles.
similar numbers.
Well, and it's cycles.
I'm gonna give you-
In 5 years, we'll have money, and in 10 years, we won't.
And then we're done.
It's like
So, no more discussion. Rachel, you have 2 minutes at 11:40. I'm gonna entertain a motion to go into closed session.
Okay. So for capital projects, I don't see a time in the near future that sales tax revenues and sales tax expenditures are going to be balanced to the point that we can be funding substantial capital projects from sales tax. We need to start looking at a new revenue source for non-utility capital projects. Property tax could be a good future choice to fund non-utility infrastructure that's required to serve our permanent population. Since our permanent population would be the ones affected by a property tax, to me, it would make sense to put that money towards infrastructure that is required to serve our permanent population. That being said, how we proceed with that in the future is entirely up to the city council, but I'm here to tell you that sales tax can no longer support capital projects. Where do we go now? The first priority as finance director that I'm putting forward to you is we need to stabilize operations. We need to live within our means. We need to bring operations back down under our revenue. So this just shows fiscal year 17 through proposed fiscal year 2022. If we do a 7% decrease in operations, you can see this is where we got upside down. This is where we would come right side up.
Which is 6 months from now, when we do our new budget.
And then by the end of 2022, potentially, we would be back to the point that we would be rebuilding that reserve in the general fund. I will say that cutting 7% is not easy, and it's not going to be pretty. And as Joel said, we have been working on a list of choices to present to you as council, so that there's options. It can be multifaceted. It's not going to be one big ticket item, but it is a process. And I will say, having held budget meetings this week with all of the departments, and then also working closely with Joel and Carly, I strongly feel that we are in the best position that we could be for having competent staff and identifying issues and identifying solutions so that we can fix this moving forward and not kick it down the road so that in 5 years we're in a much worse situation.
Okay, we've got to move on here, so I'll entertain a motion to go into an executive session.
I move to go into an executive session.
Second.
Thank you, Tawny and Karen. All those in favor?
Aye.
Rachel, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel.
Really.
Thank you.
Discuss the character